Dag Hammarskjöld is dead, but the United Nations lives. His tragedy is deep in our hearts, but the tasks for which he died are at the top of our agenda.
This is the Albertina. On board is UN Secretary-General Dag Hammarskjöld and 15 other UN employees. They're en route to negotiate a ceasefire in the Congo crisis. However, the plane will crash, which will lead to decades of speculation. Until the 19th century, much of the Congo had remained unexplored due to difficult geography. Dense rainforests, swamps, and tropical diseases had halted European interest in the territory. The man that would change that would be King Leopold II of Belgium. He had the ambition of making Belgium a colonial power. Through shrewd and smart diplomatic maneuvers, Leopold achieved his dream. Though he wasn't granted explicit territorial sovereignty, it was pretty much an occupation. It was known as the Congo Free State. Under the rule of King Leopold, the mission was publicly portrayed as philanthropic, with goals of abolishing slavery and civilizing Africa. The reality on the ground, however, was much different. Leveraging a private army, the colonial administration had installed a brutal and repressive regime to oversee the siphoning of resources such as ivory and rubber. Torture, mutilation, and mass killings became the norm if quotas weren't met. After significant public outcry, Belgium granted Congo its independence. Shortly after that, the country was plunged into chaos. The mineral-rich territory, Katanga, led by Moise Tshombe and backed by Belgian mining interests, had seceded. The UN eventually sent a peacekeeping force, but declined to engage as they saw this as an internal conflict. This led Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba to turn to the Soviets for help, which in turn angered the Americans as they viewed Congo as a vital resource during the simmering Cold War. They pressured Hammarskjöld to end this conflict as quickly as possible. The Secretary General would board his flight and be on his way to meet Moise Tshombe and end this conflict. However, as we already know, that meeting would never come to fruition. But who was Dag Hammarskjöld and why would anyone want him dead? Hammarskjöld was born in 1905 as the fourth son of then Prime Minister Hjalmar Hammarskjöld. He ended up getting many degrees covering literature, law, linguistics, and history, and subsequently pivoted towards civil service in Sweden. In 1953, he was chosen as the next UN General Secretary, with many people believing he would just be an aristocratic bureaucrat and would not try to meddle in the already established order and tumultuous times of the Cold War. However, they couldn't have been more wrong. Hammarskjöld changed the activity of the UN, transitioning it from a static organization to a proactive one that will lead the way in diplomacy and actively deploying peacekeeping troops to areas. He was also a staunch advocate for decolonization, viewing it as a moral necessity. This, of course, meant that the superpowers of the time were not his biggest supporters. The crash occurred near Ndola, northern Rhodesia, modern-day Zambia. 15 people died on impact. The lone survivor was Sergeant Harold Julian, who unfortunately ended up passing away 5 days later. We'll come back to him later. An official inquiry was launched by Rhodesian officials, which was still under British colonial administration. They secured the site, conducted preliminary examinations, and interrogated witnesses. The autopsy showed internal hemorrhaging consistent with a high-speed ground impact. They concluded that the crash had occurred due to a pilot mistake because of reduced visibility. Theories of sabotage were outrightly dismissed, and witness testimonies were branded as unreliable. In response, the UN decided to conduct their own investigation into the matter. They ended up not being able to pinpoint the clear-cut cause of this accident and pointed to the delayed access to the site, insufficient wreckage data, and the restriction of witness interviews that were under Rhodesian jurisdiction. Several unexplained inconsistencies should be mentioned. For instance, many witnesses claim they saw a bright red flash near the site shortly before the crash near the airport. Interestingly enough, the radio controller didn't see it even though he should have been looking directly in that way. On top of that, radio controllers have to take notes of their correspondence with pilots. The radio controller did take notes, but for some inexplicable reason decided to destroy them and then rewrite them 2 days later. Also, the lone survivor of the crash, Sergeant Julian, indicated that according to him, there were explosions before the crash. His testimony was deemed unreliable due to the great deal of pain he was in. Most of the bodies were badly burnt. However, Hammarskjöld's body was in better shape, and the most interesting detail was the fact that in his collar, people found the Ace of Spades card. This detail was omitted from reports, however, There's a picture of his body and a card really is visible. The Ace of Spades is generally recognized as a symbol of death. Americans use it as an intimidation tactic in Vietnam, but it is also known as a calling card of the CIA. But one revelation in South Africa was about to turn this investigation on its head.
We have discovered in the course of our investigations documents purporting to be from an institution called the South African Institute of Maritime Research, discussing the sabotage of the aircraft in which the United Nations Secretary-General Dag Hammarskjöld died.
The organization mentioned is named the South African Institute for Maritime Research, or SIMAR. The documents uncovered speak of a plot to sabotage the plane of the Secretary-General by planting a bomb. It should be noted that the plane was left unattended for a couple of hours before takeoff. The reason for this assassination plot, according to the documents, was because Hammarskjöld had become quote-unquote problematic and had to be removed. Documents also allege that MI6 and the CIA were co-conspirators. Both organizations denied the accusation and branded them as misinformation. But what exactly was SIMAR? SIMAR was a paramilitary mercenary organization that is believed to have specialized in clandestine operations in support of white supremacy in Africa. Much of what we know about the organization comes from South African journalist Devoid. He met and was given confidential documents by a man named Keith Maxwell, the leader of SIMAR. Pictures and eyewitness testimony allege that Maxwell, while not being a doctor, had opened several medical clinics exclusively for black people at little to no cost, where it's alleged that he'd experimented and injected them with unknown substances. Some of these clinics are still standing in South Africa, albeit abandoned. The group allegedly wanted to weaponize and spread AIDS throughout Africa. Maxwell also met with the former chief director of military intelligence, Tini Grunewald. In the last days of apartheid, Maxwell offered money and weapons in an attempt to arm white people and incite a civil war to maintain supremacy. Interestingly enough, throughout the documents, there's a fictionalized manuscript about Maxwell's life, written by him, named simply the Marine Institute. In it, he talks about his recruitment to SIMAR and the training he undergoes near Johannesburg dressed in all white. He's given lessons in psychological warfare and chemical weapons. After finishing his training, he goes to a clandestine laboratory in the jungles of Congo, which is funded and operated by the US Army with the goal of researching viruses and biological weapons. Maxwell ends up having a fallout with his higher-ups and goes back to a hotel in the Congo. And this is where the story ends. Not a mention of Hammarskjöld. That is, until... In 2014, a cable from US Ambassador to the Congo, Ed Guillaume, is declassified. In it, the ambassador, hours before the crash site is discovered, talks about how the Secretary General's plane might have been shot down by a well-known Belgian mercenary pilot, Jan van Rizegem, nicknamed the Lone Ranger. What adds credence to this theory is an interview done by Swedish investigative journalist Göran Björkdahl with a former NSA agent, Charles Salthal. Salthal speaks of communication they intercepted in which you can hear gunfire, which is then followed by a confirmation of a crash. The pilot's nickname on that recording, you guessed it, the Lone Ranger. After the interview, Björkdahl tracked down a friend of Rizegem and ended up getting confirmation from him that Rizegem had confessed to the crime. Adding more fuel to the fire, the documents uncovered in South Africa outlining the plot to kill Hammarskjöld pointed towards a contingency plan if the bomb plot did not succeed. That plan was a jet in the sky. Rizegem was also half British and fought for England during the Second World War, which is exactly where he got his nickname due to the operations he carried out being at night and operating alone. His pilot logbook also failed to account for the time immediately before and after the crash. On top of that, the person writing in his logbook was actually his wife. A couple more interesting facts were that Chambe, the rebel leader in Katanga, had requested 2 fighter jets from Rhodesia a day before the peace talks were about to happen. It is not clear if those fighter jets were ever delivered. In addition, there was a picture that wasn't widely circulated that showed a big hole in Hammarskjöld's plane. However, no explicit explanation of where the hole came from has ever been provided. In October 2024, the UN transmitted the latest report investigating the crash, noting that an external attack remained a plausible cause considering the new evidence that was uncovered. The UN also pressed the UK, US, and South Africa to declassify Cold War-era files, something they've been unwilling to do, citing national interest and security as causes. However, until all those files are declassified, the mystery will continue to persist.